The morning routine inside Adelaide Cottage doesn't look like a page from a history book. There are no liveried footmen clearing breakfast plates, and no quiet whispers from private secretaries standing by the doorways. Mostly, it is just the sound of heavy rain hitting the kitchen window and the familiar clutter of school blazers thrown over the backs of chairs. But on the table in the corner, resting right next to a half-empty mug of coffee, lies a manila folder that arrived via a courier from Whitehall. It contains no royal seals or wax stamps, just a staple in the top left corner and 20 pages of dense, bureaucratic text regarding the revision of the sovereign grant and the future distribution of the royal estates. For the man standing by the kettle, that folder is a ticking clock. He doesn't look at it with pride. He looks at it with the exhaustion of someone who has spent his entire adult life trying to outrun a system designed to break his family. He remembers what it felt like to be 12 years old, sitting in a cold room while men in gray suits explained that his life belonged to the nation, while his younger brother sat on the opposite side of the rug, completely uninvited to the conversation. He remembers the subtle, devastating shift that happens when children realize that the state values one of them as an institution and the other as a spare wheel. The debate currently happening within the household isn't about giving a young girl a fancy new title. It is about a structural anomaly in the British Constitution. When the current king's reign eventually comes to an end, the legal framework of the monarchy will instantly shrink. The public no longer has the appetite for a massive, sprawling network of working royals living in state-funded apartments. The future model must be lean, focused, and incredibly tight. But a lean model means that the person who inherits the throne is left completely exposed on the balcony, surrounded by advisors but entirely devoid of peers. The father's solution was to quietly alter the internal rules of their household, long before the state could intervene. He didn't hold a press conference or ask for permission from the Privy Council. Over the last winter, he simply directed the family's private tutors to merge the educational paths of his two oldest children. When the historians from Oxford come to lecture on the shifting boundaries of the British Empire or the legal mechanics of the Magna Carta, there are no longer separate sessions. The girl sits at the same table as the boy, using the same notebooks, answering the same historical queries, and looking at the same maps of a country they will one day have to manage together. This decision didn't come without a quiet, lingering friction within the home. The mother has spent years creating a wall between her children and the public glare. She knows what happens when the media begins to treat a young girl as a political asset or a symbol of modernization. She has fought for ordinary bedtimes, for dirty knees from football in the garden, and for weekends where the crown doesn't exist. She looked at the new joint schedule not as an honor, but as a theft. She saw her daughter's free time being slowly chipped away by the heavy, dry texts of constitutional law. The argument reached its peak on a Thursday evening when the rain finally stopped. There were no raised voices. That isn't how things are handled in this house. It was just the sound of a fountain pen scratching against paper as the father signed his name to the final educational directive. The mother stood by the door, her coat already on for the dog walk, watching him close the folder. She didn't ask him to change his mind. She knew the choice had already been made in his head years ago. Born from the pain of his own brotherhood, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light of the hallway, and said that he was doing this because he refused to let his son stand alone in the dark when the time came. Outside the house, the palace bureaucracy began to push back in its usual, bloodless manner. Senior courtiers who had spent 40 years managing the royal image sent long, polite memos suggesting that a joint training program would blur the lines of succession. They worried that the public would see the young girl's elevated role as a sign that the heir was somehow incapable or weak. They wanted her to have a traditional, limited pass patronages of arts charities, appearances at flower shows, and a lifetime of standing 3 paces behind her brother at official arrivals. The father didn't write back. He simply left the memos on his desk, letting the dust gather on the corners until the courtiers realized that their objections were landing on stone. He knew that the old system was built for a world that no longer existed, a world where the family could hide its flaws behind heavy velvet curtains and grand titles. In the modern era, where every camera phone is a potential headline, the only thing that survives is absolute transparency and unyielding family loyalty. He wasn't building a defensive line. The actual moment that forced this change did not happen during a grand ceremony in London, nor did it begin with a legal document. It happened on a freezing November afternoon in Windsor, during a minor youth event that wasn't even scheduled for the main evening news broadcast. The eldest boy, then just 10, was supposed to walk down the stone steps of the chapel alone to shake hands with a line of young ambassadors from across the Commonwealth. It was his first real test without his parents planking him a small, carefully controlled step toward public life. But 3 minutes before the doors opened, an urgent phone call regarding the king's health disrupted the entire schedule. The father was pulled into a side room by his protection officers, leaving the boy standing alone in the drafty, echoing space of the porch. Outside, the flashbulbs were already going off, the crowd was chanting, and the television cameras were zoomed in on the doorway. Without his father's hand on his shoulder, the boy froze. His breathing became rapid, his fingers knotted tightly around the hem of his jacket, and he looked back at the empty corridor behind him with a raw, unmistakable panic. The staff standing around him didn't know what to do. Protocol didn't allow them to step into the frame, and none of them wanted to be the one to pull the future king out of the event and create a story about his nerves. They just stood there, watching a child drown in the light. It was his sister who walked into the gap. She didn't look at the courtiers or ask for a nod from the security team. She simply walked over, grabbed his cold hand, and squeezed it until he looked down at her. She didn't use any grand words about duty or the family name. She just told him that they were going to walk to the first car together and that she wouldn't let go until they reached the door. When the signal came, she moved forward, her pace perfectly level with his, her small boots making a steady click against the stone. The father watched the footage later that night on a small monitor in his study. He didn't look at the crowd or the diplomats. He just watched his daughter's eyes. He saw the way she kept her head up, ignoring the shouting photographers, while her shoulders stayed pressed against her brother's side, offering a physical anchor that the entire British Constitution couldn't provide. He realized then that the children had already figured out how to survive the machine. They just needed the adults to get out of the way and let them do it. When he went upstairs to say goodnight, he found her sitting on the rug in her room, untying her shoes. He sat down on the edge of the unmade bed and asked her what she had been thinking when she walked out onto those steps. She looked up at him with that sharp, direct gaze she had inherited from her mother's side of the family, and said she did it because her brother looked like he was about to fall over, and she didn't want everyone to watch him do it alone. That conversation changed everything. It forced the father to look at the wreckage of his own youth, the separate schools, the different expectations, and the systemic isolation that had slowly turned his own brother from an ally into an outsider. The palace had always believed the only way to protect the crown was to isolate the heir, to make him separate and special, while leaving the rest of the family to float in the margins. It was a strategy that had successfully protected the line of succession for 300 years, but it had done so by burning every bridge within the family itself. He spent the next morning working with his private secretary, reshaping the internal guidelines that govern their household expenses and travel arrangements. He made sure that from that day forward, the security details, the travel schedules, and the private briefings were fully integrated. There would be no separate arrivals, no isolated waiting rooms, and no events where the boy was elevated at the direct expense of his sister's presence. They were to be seen by the household as a single unit, a partnership that could not be divided by the old politics of the court. The older generation of the family viewed these changes with a quiet, persistent skepticism. They had been raised in a different era, where the boundaries between the direct line and the siblings were absolute and unquestioned. They worried that by giving the young girl such a prominent, professionalized role so early, the father was creating a secondary center of gravity within the family, one that would eventually invite the very comparison and rivalry he was trying to prevent. But the father remained completely deaf to their warnings. He had already seen the alternative, and he was no longer willing to let the old rules dictate the survival of his home. The final signature did not take place at a grand desk in a stateroom. It happened late on a Tuesday night at Clarence House, in a small room crowded with old books and the smell of wood smoke. The grandfather sat in a leather armchair, a pair of reading spectacles perched on the end of his nose, looking at the two different versions of the family's future that his son had laid out before him. The first document was the traditional draft compiled by the old guard, which kept the focus exclusively on the direct line. The second was the revised framework, the one that legally bound the siblings to a shared path of service. The grandfather didn't speak for a long time. He knew the cost of the office better than anyone in the country. He had spent 70 years waiting in the wings, watching his own siblings try to find a purpose in an institution that defined them only by their distance from the throne. He remembered the long, quiet sacrifices of his sister, the Princess Royal, who had worked harder than any politician in the country for 50 years, always in the shadow of a line she could never cross. He looked up at his son, who was standing by the window, his arms folded, looking out at the rainy London street. The son made his position completely clear, without using the formal language of the court. He told his father that the old ways were a luxury they could no longer afford. The media was too sharp, the public was too cynical, and the pressure on a single individual was too great for anyone to survive it without a trusted partner at their side. He wanted his daughter to have a defined, professional purpose from the start, so that she would never have to spend her 20s searching for a role or fighting the palace bureaucracy for a sense of relevance. The grandfather looked down at the paper, his pen hovering over the line. He recalled a conversation he had held with his own mother in that very building decades ago, when she had warned him that the family's survival would eventually depend on its ability to drop the old, rigid hierarchies and work as a modern collective. With a slow, deliberate movement, he signed his name to the revised framework, securing the joint path for the next generation. He added only one short, handwritten note in the margin. "Keep them kids for as long as you can." The public announcement of the new joint training schedule was released without the usual fanfare, appearing as a small paragraph on the back pages of the court circular. But the press immediately picked up on the shift. Within hours, the front pages were filled with photographs of the brother and sister walking level through the palace grounds, with headlines talking about the end of the traditional royal sibling dynamic. The commentators began their usual round of analysis, debating whether the father was modernizing the family or simply shifting the pressure onto a different child. Inside Adelaide Cottage, the television stayed dark. The mother had already gone to bed, leaving the two oldest children sitting at the wooden kitchen table, eating toast and looking at the morning papers that had been left out for the staff. The boy pointed to a large photograph on the front page, noting that the printers had adjusted the contrast to make his jacket look brighter than his sister's, even though they were wearing the same school uniform. The girl looked at the image, took a bite of her toast, and casually flipped the newspaper over so that the crossword puzzle was facing up. She looked at her brother and told him that what people printed in the morning didn't change where they were going to walk that afternoon. That small, unbothered remark was the real confirmation that the father's plan had succeeded. The rules of the palace had been rewritten, not to create a new type of courtier or to appease the constitutional lawyers, but to preserve the simple, human trust between two children who would one day have to carry the weight of a kingdom. By changing the system before the system could fracture his home, a father had finally broken the ancient cycle of the court, ensuring that when the next crown was finally passed down, it would be carried not by a lonely king standing by himself, but by a family that had learned how to face the proofs, world together,